Chapter 1. The Man Who Walked with God. In the quiet dawn of creation's story, names rise like soft footprints in the soil of time. Among them, tucked gently between generations and genealogies, rests a name that feels like a whispered secret: Enoch. Not a conqueror, not a king, not even a builder of altars or cities, just Enoch. A name placed seventh from Adam in a line shaped by divine breath and human longing. 7. The number echoes with a sacred stillness. In the rhythm of creation, it marked rest. In Enoch's place within the generations, it marked completion. He was the seventh, and in him something ancient and holy seemed to settle. Others lived and died with a pattern of toil, of suns and years, of dust and return. But Enoch's entry into the sacred record glows with a different light. The scriptures do not describe his youth, nor his labors, nor his flaws. There is no war to define him, no field to claim. Only a phrase more powerful than stories of swords or strength. Enoch walked with God. These words do not shout. They do not hurry. They move like a stream through Eden, soft and sacred. And in that walking, a door opened. Enoch was not a prophet who thundered warnings, not a patriarch who fathered nations. Yet somehow, in his simple closeness to God, he was set apart, the seventh from Adam. Not the end of a line, but the quiet beginning of something deeper. A life set apart. Enoch lived in days when the world began to forget. The memories of Eden still lingered like mist in the morning, but they were growing faint. Humanity's hands reached downward, toward the earth, toward pride, toward violence. But Enoch's heart turned the other way. While others built their lives from clay and ambition, Enoch built his life from nearness. He was not a priest, for there was yet no tabernacle. He offered no lambs, burned no incense. His offering was his walk. Step by step, breath by breath, he moved in rhythm with heaven's pace. To the world he may have seemed strange, distant, quiet, uninterested in the noise of growing cities. But to heaven, he was familiar. His soul sang a melody that God remembered. The days of Enoch were not easy. He lived among men who were beginning to call good things evil and treat the sacred as if it were dust. But Enoch did not curse the darkness. He simply walked with the light. In fields where others forgot the sound of God's voice, Enoch heard it in the wind. In nights when stars seemed far, he listened to the silence and found the presence of God still near. His life became a lantern, not blazing, but warm, not demanding, but devoted. He was not set apart by fame or fortune, but by quiet faithfulness. The world looked for power, but Enoch had found something different: intimacy. And so he walked, not once, not twice, but all his days, through seasons and silence, through laughter and longing. Every step became a sacred echo, a gentle resistance to the tide of forgetfulness. And he was not then, came the verse that pauses all breath, so small, so silent, yet thunderous in its mystery. And he was not, for God took him. No warning, no illness, no fading. Just gone. Not into dust, but into something unknown. There is no grave that bears his name. no stone, no sorrowing, crowd, no weeping widow, just a space where he once walked, empty yet holy. The world could not hold him any more. Heaven had stretched out its hand, and Enoch stepped beyond. This was not death as others knew it. There was no mention of last words or final moments. It was not loss, but invitation. God did not let Enoch taste the decay of time. Instead, he drew him up, as one might gather a beloved child into their arms after a long walk home. What did he see, this man of mystery? Did the skies part before him? Did angelic songs rise like rivers of light? Did he behold the throne, the glory, the golden sea? We do not know. Scripture veils that moment in silence, as if even words must bow before such wonder. But the very silence speaks. It says, there is more. That this life is not the end, that those who walk with God may one day be gathered, not by sickness, not by sorrow, but by the hand of God himself. And he was not lost, not ended, simply no longer here. The echo of that phrase lingers like dew, sweet, still, and full of promise. A whisper of what could be. In the gentle unfolding of Enoch's story, something eternal stirs. A quiet voice in the heart of Scripture whispers, it is possible. It is possible to live a life not ruled by fear, not owned by the earth. It is possible to walk so closely with God that the veil between this world and the next becomes thin, not torn by pain, but opened by love. Enoch's life is not a command, but a calling. Not a blueprint, but an invitation. He was not perfect, but he was present. He was not powerful, but he was faithful. He did not build monuments or write laws. He simply walked. And in that walk, he became a living prophecy, a sign of what was to come. Long before Elijah was taken in a chariot of fire, Enoch was taken in quietness. Long before Jesus rose in glory, Enoch rose in mystery. His life foreshadowed something greater, that death is not the master, that there is a path that leads beyond the grave, not through violence or triumph, but through intimacy. When later scriptures mention him, they do so with reverence. The book of Hebrews remembers him as one who pleased God. Jude speaks of him as one who saw far ahead. But the Genesis account remains the softest. It tells us only that he walked and he was not. Perhaps that is all we need to know, that in a world of noise, Enoch chose the quiet path. That in a world of striving, he chose surrender. That in a world of fading shadows, he walked with the eternal light. And so the story of Enoch ends, not in death, but in ascension. Not with a cry, but with a whisper. A whisper that still reaches across centuries to those willing to listen. A whisper that says, walk. Walk not in fear, but in faith. Walk not in haste, but in holiness. Walk with God, and perhaps, like Enoch, you too will find that one day this walk will carry you beyond the horizon, into the arms of the one who has walked beside you all along. Chapter 2: The Hidden Book and Its Return. There are books that speak loudly through history, and then there are those that whisper. The Book of Enoch whispered. It did not shout from pulpits nor proclaim itself with fanfare. It waited like a buried lamp beneath centuries of soil, its glow dimmed but never gone. For thousands of years it was known not by its presence but by its absence. Mentioned in ancient writings, remembered in scattered verses, Enoch's words hovered at the edges of Scripture like morning mist. The earliest fathers of the faith knew of it. Jude, in his epistle, quoted it. Yet over time the voice of Enoch seemed to fall silent. Hidden in the folds of time, the book survived not in cathedrals or royal libraries, but in the quiet places of the world. It lived in memory and in mystery. Monks in distant lands, high in the green mountains of Ethiopia, guarded it as one might guard a sacred flame, not with swords, but with ink and reverence. And when the Western world believed it was gone forever, the book still breathed. It had not vanished. It had simply gone still, waiting for the moment it would be heard again. In the 18th century, travelers and scholars stumbled upon it in the highlands of Ethiopia. The discovery felt like hearing the voice of a long-lost friend, aged but alive. The Book of Enoch had not perished. It had been kept, not by force, not by power, but by faith, quiet, enduring faith. The kind that copies a scroll by hand under candlelight, even when no one else remembers why. Why was it lost? The early church did not turn away from Enoch quickly. In the beginning, it was a book of wonder, a text full of angels, watchers, and dreams of heaven. Some believed it filled in the spaces between Genesis and Revelation. It was a bridge to the mysteries that Scripture hinted at but did not fully explain. But in time, the winds of power changed, councils gathered, decisions were made. The canon of Scripture was shaped not only by faith, but by the need for clarity and order. And Enoch, with its visions of stars that walk and angels who fall, was considered too strange, too bold, too much. Some feared it would confuse the faithful. Others said it was too mystical, too apocalyptic. They did not call it false, but they did call it dangerous. So they set it aside, and so the book that once stood in honor slowly slipped from view. It was not burned, it was not erased, but it was no longer copied, no longer taught. It became a forgotten echo, with a voice remembered only in fragments. Yet even as it was lost in one part of the world, it found sanctuary in another. Like a seed carried by the wind, it took root where hearts were open. The Book of Enoch was not removed from history. It was hidden by the choices of men, hidden perhaps by the hand of God, not destroyed, only delayed. In this there is a sacred lesson, that truth may sleep, but it does not die, that what is silenced today may sing again tomorrow, and that some voices, though muted for a time, are never truly gone. A voice, preserved by mountains, far from Rome, far from Constantinople, beyond the great councils and cathedrals, there were mountains. And in those mountains there were men, quiet, devout, enduring. They were monks of the Ethiopian church, guardians of an ancient rhythm of worship, where Scripture lived not only in words, but in song, in silence, and in daily life. To them, the Book of Enoch was not forgotten. It was Scripture. It was sacred. It was part of their breath and being. For them there was no question. They held what others had cast aside, not in rebellion, but in reverence. They copied the book by hand, not once, not twice, but generation after generation. They passed it on not through debate, but through devotion. In quiet chambers lit by olive oil lamps, on parchment stretched thin by time, the words of Enoch lived on. The world outside changed. Empires rose and fell. Theology shifted. New languages emerged, but in those hills the scrolls remained, as steady as stone, as faithful as a heartbeat. It is easy to think that great things happen only in great places, in thrones and temples, in cities and seats of power. But the Book of Enoch tells another story, that sometimes God hides his treasures in small places, that sometimes the mountains remember what the valleys forget, and that when all seems lost, heaven still watches. The Ethiopian church did not preserve the book for recognition or reward. They preserved it because they believed it mattered, and in doing so, they became the stewards of a sacred echo, one that would one day be heard again by the world. The book that refused to die. And now in our time, the Book of Enoch has returned. It has not returned to claim a throne among the canon. It does not seek to replace or rewrite what has been revealed. It comes instead like a witness, quiet, clear, and full of mystery. Its pages speak of watchers and judgments, of stars that sing and heavens that open. They speak of a world before the flood, of angels who fell from grace, and of a man, Enoch, who walked with God until he was not. It is not a book that answers all questions. It is a book that deepens them. It invites the reader not to certainty, but to wonder. Not to division, but to awe. Its voice is not the thunder of Sinai, but the whisper of Eden, the echo of a world too deep for words. And perhaps that is why it was hidden. Perhaps some truths are not meant to be shouted. Perhaps they are meant to be found, slowly, sacredly, by those who seek with reverence. The Book of Enoch is not scripture for all, but it is scripture for some, and even for those who do not. Call it canon, there is wisdom to be found in its lines, a reminder that God has always spoken in many ways, through prophets and dreams, through visions and voices that defy understanding. It is a book that reminds us that heaven is closer than we think, that angels walk among us, that judgment is real and so is mercy, and that one man, long before the flood, walked so closely with God that he did not die, but was taken. And now his voice returns, not to disturb, but to deepen, not to undo, but to awaken. The Book of Enoch refused to die because truth, when breathed in faith, cannot be buried. It may sleep, but it always wakes. Chapter 3. The Watchers Who Fell. In the beginning, when the earth was young and the stars sang over silent valleys, there were beings called the Watchers. They were not of dust nor of clay, but of spirit, radiant ones who stood at the threshold, between the heavens above and the earth below. Their task was not to rule, nor to shape, nor to speak. Their calling was simpler, yet sacred. They were to watch. Appointed by the Most High, the Watchers were entrusted with a reverent silence. They were the holy witnesses placed among the heavenly realms to behold creation, to observe the unfolding of God's will in the world of men. Their eyes, like windows of light, saw the rising of empires and the quiet sowing of seeds, the laughter of children, and the first offerings placed upon stone altars. They did not interfere. They did not guide. They watched as the Creator himself had commanded. And in this watching, they honored the delicate veil between what is seen and what is unseen. Their station was not a punishment nor a lesser post. It was holy, sacred. They were the sentinels of the sky, the silent choir that bore witness to humanity's walk through the ages. With every dawn, they watched. With every twilight, they bowed. But the line between reverence and curiosity is thin. And in time, the stillness of their watching began to waver. Not all, but some. Their gaze, once full of awe, began to linger too long. Their silence grew heavy, and the seeds of longing began to stir. A forbidden desire among the valleys and rivers of the early earth, life blossomed in quiet rhythms. Trees stretched toward the sun, animals grazed the open fields, and mankind, still close to Eden in memory, walked in the morning dew with unspoiled wonder. The daughters of men were radiant, not with the glow of angels, but with the gentle beauty of flesh and breath, of laughter and sorrow, of love shaped in mortal form. And the watchers, those meant to observe with reverence, saw. They saw, not as God sees, in perfect love and wisdom, but with the stirring of desire. The boundary blurred. What had been sacred distance turned to yearning. What was once duty became temptation. It was not all the watchers, but it was enough. Their leader was Simjaza, a figure of great presence and strength. Among the watchers he stood tall, not by force, but by voice, and his voice, once echoing with praise, now trembled with unrest. He saw the longing that flickered in the eyes of the others, and he feared, not for righteousness, but for himself. He feared that if he acted alone, he would bear the weight of it alone. So he spoke, and he persuaded, and he made a pact. "We shall descend together," he said. "We shall take wives from among the children of men. But let us swear to this thing, so that none may turn back and leave the rest to fall alone." And so the pact was made. Not in heaven, but upon the earth, not with God, but against him. They were angels, once holy. Now they desired what was not given. They would no longer only watch. They would reach. And in that reaching, the order of heaven would tremble. The oath on Mount Hermon, there is a mountain, ancient and vast, whose peaks stretch into the skies like fingers of stone. Mount Hermon, veiled in mist and crowned with silence, stood like a sentinel of secrets. It was here, not in heaven's courts nor in the temples of men, that the watchers chose to seal their oath. 200 in number, they gathered at twilight. The winds whispered through cedar branches. The sky, once radiant, now darkened, as if creation itself held its breath. Simjaza stood before them. His voice was steady, his gaze unflinching. One by one, the watchers agreed. They raised their hands, not in worship, but in rebellion. And they swore. The oath was not shouted, it was solemn, sealed in unity and silence. And when the last word was spoken, the heavens seemed to shift. A boundary had been broken, not of distance, but of design. They descended, not as light, but as fire, not as messengers, but as men. Each took for himself a wife from the daughters of earth, and the children they bore were not as others. They were mighty, but not blessed. Giants, the Nephilim, who filled the land with strength and sorrow, power and violence. They were born of union never meant to be, of love twisted by rebellion, and knowledge too they brought. The Watchers taught the secrets of heaven to mankind, the making of weapons, the use of enchantments, the mysteries of stars and roots and signs, what was meant for the sacred halls of angels now spilled into the hands of the unready. Mount Hermon, once a place of quiet stone, became the place of the oath, a symbol of the fall, a witness to heaven's grief. Heaven grieves. The sin of the Watchers was not of ignorance, it was choice. Holy ones who knew the weight of what they did, yet did it still. And heaven, once still in its perfect peace, now stirred with sorrow. The cry of the earth rose, not in words, but in pain. The world, shaped in harmony, now groaned beneath the feet of giants. Violence grew like thorns in a garden once tended by angels. Innocence fell like leaves in the wind. The Most High saw, and he grieved. He sent no fire, not yet. He sent no flood, not yet. But he sent watchers still, not to stand by, but to judge. Archangels were stirred, Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel, the messengers of God, mighty in mercy and in wrath. They beheld what the fallen ones had done. They saw the corruption of the earth, the sorrow of mothers, the cries of the innocent, and they were sent, not with swords at first, but with commands. The fallen were to be bound. Their children, the Nephilim, would pass away. The knowledge they spread would be silenced, and a flood would wash the earth clean. But before the judgment, there was grief, for even the justice of God does not come without mourning. He had made the Watchers. He had given them their station, their glory, their purpose, and they had turned away. Heaven does not rejoice in ruin. The stars do not sing for wrath. The angels who remained did not scorn their fallen brothers. They wept. Because sin is not merely the breaking of law, it is the breaking of love, and in that breaking, the heart of heaven ached. The fall of the Watchers was not just a tale of rebellion, it was a wound in the fabric of creation, a moment when the sacred order bent beneath the weight of longing, a moment that would echo through time until the one who came to restore all things would walk the earth and carry sorrow upon his shoulders. The Book of Enoch records this moment not to cast fear, but to awaken reverence, to remind us that even the highest can fall, that even angels must guard their hearts, that watching is a holy gift, and that when we cross the lines God has drawn, we do not gain power, we lose peace. And yet, even in this, even in the fall, God does not abandon the story. He begins the slow work of restoration, one promise at a time, one generation at a time, until grace descends again, not in fire, but in flesh. Chapter 4. The Birth of Giants. There are moments in the story of the world where heaven bends too close to the earth, not in blessing, but in sorrow. One such moment began in the shadow of rebellion, when the Watchers descended and took for themselves daughters of men. From these forbidden unions, something strange was born. They were not like Adam. They were not like the angels. They were something in between, and something far beyond. The Nephilim, they were giants, but not just in size. Their strength defied reason. Their stature darkened valleys and stirred fear wherever they walked. Yet their power was not holy, for it came from a mingling that should never have been. These children of heaven's watchers and earth's daughters did not walk humbly. They roamed with a pride that touched the sky. Their laughter carried through forests like thunder. Their footsteps shook the soil like tremors. Wherever they went, people stepped aside, hearts trembling in quiet dread. What should have been a marvel became a warning. What looked like might concealed a great sorrow. For the Nephilim were born of disobedience, and their presence carried that brokenness into everything they touched. They built cities of stone. They carved weapons no man had seen. They raised monuments to themselves, their eyes searching always for more land, more dominion, more worship. They were not content to live. They needed to rule, but the world had not been made for such giants. The rhythms of life that God had spoken into being, the quiet sowing, the gentle reaping, the holy stillness of evening, began to unravel beneath their shadow. The Nephilim were not just mighty, they were unyielding, and soon their hunger would show the true cost of their power. A hunger that devoured at first. They ate the fruits of the field and drank the waters of streams. But giants are not fed so easily. Their need was greater than the land could bear. And when the harvest no longer satisfied, they turned to the herds. Cattle disappeared. Sheep vanished in the night. Even the wild beasts began to grow scarce, but still they hungered. It was not a hunger of the body alone. It was something deeper, a hollowness that came from being born of a broken bond, from walking without true belonging. Their fathers were angels, their mothers were mortal, and they were caught between worlds. They began to take what was not given. What once was shared in kindness was now seized by force. Villages fell silent as the giants approached. Fires were doused, children were hidden. The people knew where the Nephilim walked, peace did not follow. And soon it was not only animals they devoured. It is written in sorrowed lines. The giants turned upon mankind, not in war, but in consumption. The earth had become a place of dread. Men no longer feared lions or serpents, but their own twisted kin. The ones who bore some spark of heaven, but whose hearts knew only appetite. Their thirst knew no end, their hunger no bounds. What once had been created in beauty, the harmony of earth and its creatures, the gift of bread from soil and joy from labor, was now being torn apart. The land, weary from their trampling, cried out. The trees, stripped bare, stood like mourners. Even the rivers, once clear and alive, seemed sluggish, as if heavy with grief. The Nephilim did not see it, or perhaps they did not care. For pride and hunger often walk hand in hand, each feeding the other, and the more they consumed, the more they were consumed themselves, by madness, by cruelty, by a darkness that no food or dominion could satisfy. The key tearing of the world, once woven with divine care, began to fray. Balance, the quiet rhythm that marked the days of Eden, gave way to chaos. The earth, so long a place of worship and wonder, became a land of fear. Nature itself recoiled. Animals grew wild, either fleeing from the giants or becoming as fierce as them. Birds no longer sang at sunrise, they screamed. Storms came unseasonably, winds howling through the valleys like the cries of forgotten angels. The stars, so steady before, now seemed distant, as if they watched from behind a veil, sorrowing, silent. Even the moon, once gentle in her nightly watch, rose red as blood and looked upon the land without peace. And between all of this, the trembling earth, the broken sky, stood mankind. They had not made the giants, they had not called them forth, and yet they suffered under them. They could not flee to the heavens, and the heavens did not yet answer. People lived now not in hope, but in hiding. Families that once tilled the land together now scattered. Fields, once full of wheat and prayer, lay ruined. The old songs, the ones passed down from Adam, the melodies of dawn and covenant, were no longer sung. The harmony that God had spoken in the beginning was unraveling. What had been called good now groaned under the weight of what had gone wrong. And the beauty of creation, once a mirror of its maker, began to dim. Not because God had withdrawn, but because his creation had turned from the order he had made. Still, even in the unraveling, he watched, not in silence, but in sorrow. For the Maker never forgets his work, and what is torn can be mended, but first it must be seen for what it is. A world in mourning, the earth does not grieve as men grieve, it grieves in silence, in stillness, in the slow fading of what once was full of life. Mothers held their children close, whispering lullabies with trembling lips. They no longer told stories of stars and gardens, but of hiding places and giants in the hills. The innocence of youth, dimmed beneath the weight of fear. The fields gave little, the rains came late. The skies, once alive with color and birdsong, now hung gray and heavy. It was as if creation itself had entered mourning. Priests still prayed, but their prayers were softer now, not for plenty, but for mercy. Elders still gathered, but not to teach. They wept, they remembered, they watched as what had been so good slowly slipped from their hands. And all the while, the Nephilim laughed, not because they were cruel, though some were, but because they did not understand. Born of brokenness, they carried that brokenness into all things. Their joy was a hollow sound echoing off the ruins of the world they had helped unmake. But among the sorrow, something else began to stir. It began in whispers, in quiet corners, of villages in hearts too tired to speak, but not yet ready to give up. It was a cry, not loud, not fierce, but persistent. A cry that rose not from strength, but from sorrow. A cry that climbed past the clouds and touched the ears of God. The extended world did not know what it was calling for. It only knew that it could not go on, that something had to change, that the sorrow was too deep, the hunger too wide, the giants too many, and God, who had watched and waited, began to prepare, not in haste, not in rage, but in mercy. For even in mourning, the world still belonged to its Maker, and no grief, no matter how great, is ever beyond his healing hand. Chapter 5. The Forbidden Teachings. In the early morning of the world, when the breath of Eden still lingered in the air, knowledge was not yet a burden. It was a gift entrusted slowly by the Creator, like dew upon the grass, gentle, timely, and guided by grace. But when the watchers descended, they brought with them the secrets of heaven, and they gave those secrets to mankind before the soul was ready to receive them. It began with fire, the forging of metal, the shaping of swords, the crafting of tools, not just for harvest, but for harm. The watchers taught men to draw power from the earth, to dig deep and smelt the hidden ores, to create weapons from the very bones of creation. Iron no longer remained buried in the hills. It was sharpened into blades that turned brother against brother. They taught the reading of stars, or not to marvel at the majesty of the heavens, but to predict and control. Men began to search the skies, not for signs of God's glory, but for ways to guide their own will. Astrology replaced awe. Charts replaced worship. Herbs, too, were transformed. What God had planted for healing and food, the watchers twisted into tools of enchantment. Roots were no longer crushed for balm, but for spells. Leaves were burned not for warmth, but to invoke shadows. These were not wicked things in themselves, but the timing, the intention, that was the danger. For knowledge, when received apart from wisdom, becomes a curse. The children of men, still young in spirit, took the teachings with wonder. But wonder soon turned to pride. And pride, as it always does, led to pain. The world was not yet ready for the power of angels, and the watchers, once guardians of heaven's stillness, had become sowers of chaos. What should have been guarded was thrown open. What should have been sealed was scattered. And the earth, once a sanctuary, became a forge of sorrow. The beautifying of sin among the teachings of the fallen ones, there was one that glittered softly but cut deeply, the art of beautifying the body. The watchers taught the daughters of men how to paint their faces, how to adorn their skin with colors and powders, how to charm the eyes with shimmer and shadow. They brought gems from the hills and taught how to shape them, how to string them, how to make them sparkle beneath the sun. Gold, once buried in silence, now hung around necks and wrists, shimmering like false stars. What began as adornment became disguise. What was once a natural glow of life became a painted veil. The heart was no longer the mirror of beauty. The mirror itself had become the judge. And in this transformation, something sacred began to slip away. Women, once honored for their tenderness, their wisdom, their strength, now found themselves measured by appearance. And men, once seekers of character and soul, began to hunger for outward forms. Vanity grew like a vine, soft but strong. It crept into homes, into marriages, into the thoughts of children. Nations rose around images of beauty, not of holiness. Songs no longer praised the righteous, but the adorned, and eyes turned ever more outward, forgetting the quiet glory within. The watchers had not only taught the forging of metal, they had forged mirrors, not of glass, but of perception, and in those mirrors the people no longer saw God's image. They saw only themselves. Sin was no longer feared. It was dressed, perfumed, and praised. It was given bracelets and silk and led to the center of the stage. And as the applause rose, truth grew quiet. Modesty stepped back. Holiness was forgotten. It was not merely rebellion. It was seduction, the beautifying of what was broken. And in that seduction the soul grew sleepy. Conscience became dull, and the nations began to drift, slowly, away from the voice of the one who had formed them. Sorcery and spellbinding. There was a time when prayers rose like incense and people called upon the name above all names in reverence. But when the forbidden knowledge took root, the voice of prayer was joined and then drowned by the voice of spells. The Watchers had taught not only herbs and stars, but incantations, phrases that bent the unseen, rituals that mimicked the sacred, gestures that imitated worship but turned it inward. The people no longer waited on God. They began to command the air, the fire, the rain. They believed they could conjure what once came only through covenant. They sought shortcuts to power, signs without surrender, wonders without worship. Root cutting became common, not for healing, but for hexing. Words were whispered not for blessing, but for control. The sacred rhythm of creation, where all things flowed from God and returned to Him, was interrupted. People stopped listening for the still, small voice. Instead, they surrounded themselves with chants and charms. They no longer laid their hearts bare before the Lord. They carved symbols into stones and bones, believing magic to be mightier than mercy. The line between worship and manipulation began to blur. What had once been holy became theatrical. What had once been mysterious became performative. And in this imitation of the sacred, the soul starved. For man was not made to wield power as angels do. He was made to walk humbly with his God. But now, with eyes fixed on signs and hands full of spell books, he walked in shadows, believing he had gained light, but losing his way. The Watchers had given men the tools, but it was men who chose to use them not for healing, not for prayer, but for control. And what was meant to draw mankind upward now dragged him deeper into confusion. Heaven watched and grieved. For what had once been a garden of joy had become a stage of illusion. The fruit of knowledge, once sweet in Eden, now turned bitter in their mouths' corruption. Like a flood, there is a difference between curiosity and corruption. One seeks to understand in order to worship more deeply. The other seeks to replace worship with control. In the days after the Watchers taught mankind, curiosity turned swiftly into corruption, like a small stream swelling into a river and then into a flood. What began in wonder ended in ruin. The hearts of men grew bold, but not in holiness. Bold in pride, bold in secrecy, bold in their belief that they could rise without God, that they could reach the stars by spells and symbols, and slowly the earth, this sacred dwelling formed by God's own breath, began to darken. Justice was forgotten, kindness became rare. Mercy, once sung in lullabies and etched into laws, was laughed at. Children grew up learning spells before they learned to pray. Young men desired wealth before they knew wisdom. Maidens painted their faces before they understood their worth. The heavens so long patient could remain silent no longer. The angels watched. and then they were sent. For corruption does not go unnoticed by the one who shaped the world with holiness. The Lord, who had once rested from his creation, now rose to respond to its corruption, not in fury, nay, but in justice, not in haste, but in truth. Heaven did not rush with thunder. It approached slowly as a cloud filled with sorrow. For God's judgments are never empty. They are filled with grief. Grief for what was lost. Grief for what was loved. Grief for what might have been. The corruption that swept the earth was like a flood before the flood, a wave of forgetting, a tide of twisted truth. It left nothing untouched, but in the shadows a new whisper began to stir. Not from magic, not from mirrors, from faith, a remnant still remained. Quiet hearts who had not bowed, gentle souls who still prayed, and the Lord saw them. And in the chapters yet to come, we will see that even when the world forgets, God remembers. Chapter 6. The Cry That Reached Heaven. There is a sound that rises when words fail, a sound born not from mouths but from hearts. It is the cry of the innocent, the sigh of the weary, the silent plea of those who suffer in stillness. In the Yash, days after the watchers fell and the Nephilim spread across the earth, this sound began to grow. The world was no longer as it had been. Peace had fled from the valleys. Justice, once a companion of every village and home, now hid like a frightened bird. The innocent were trampled, their voices small beneath the heavy feet of giants. And yet they cried out, not all at once, not with thunder or fanfare, but steadily, like morning mist rising from wounded fields. Mothers held children in trembling arms. Fathers stared into broken soil where crops no longer grew. Youth looked at the skies and wondered why they were silent. And still they cried, not always with sound, but always with hope. It was not only the people, the ground itself gave voice. Blood had been spilled, too much, too often, and it cried out just as the blood of Abel once had. From the fields where the Nephilim had struck down the weak, from the rivers that ran darker than they should, the earth groaned in sorrow. The prayers of the oppressed were not eloquent. They did not come wrapped in holy language. They rose as raw need, as aching grief, as trembling trust that somewhere above the stars, beyond the pain, someone still listened, and he did. The Creator, who had formed man from the dust and breathed life into his frame, heard every sigh. Not one cry was missed, not one tear fell unnoticed. The cries rose and heaven turned its ear. The world did not know it yet, but judgment had begun to stir. Not with rage, but with mercy. For when God hears the cry of the oppressed, he does not remain still. He moves, slow and sacred, like morning light, pushing back the darkness. The archangels, here high above the earth, where no foot had ever trod and no corruption could reach, the heavenly ones stood watch. Michael, the warrior of righteousness, Uriel, the keeper of light and truth, Gabriel, the herald of divine messages, and Raphael, the healer of God's creation. Each of them had watched as the world changed. They had seen the watchers fall, not only in place but in purpose. They had seen the Nephilim rise, not only in stature but in sin. And now they heard something new, the cry. It reached them not as sound but as sorrow. A great aching, that pressed upon their spirit like a cloud. They looked upon the earth and saw fields torn open, skies made silent, children lost in fear. And they knew the time of silence was ending. They did not act on impulse. The angels of the Most High do not rush. They gather, they reflect, they carry grief in holy stillness. And then they bring it before the One who sits above all thrones. They ascended not as flames, but as reverent servants, each bearing a part of the sorrow, each carrying the cries of the earth like sacred offerings. They brought the matter to the court of the king, not for vengeance, but for justice. For the earth was not theirs, it was his. And the harm done to the least of his creation had risen to his heart. The watchers had taught corruption. The Nephilim had multiplied violence. And still God had waited, not from weakness, but from mercy. Yet now the archangels stood before him, and the time had come to speak. The silence of heaven was about to end. A court in heaven. There are courts on earth, filled with stone and laws and the trembling of men, but above them all is another court, older, wiser, infinite. A place not of politics but of purity. A place where truth cannot be twisted and justice cannot be bribed. It was in this court that the cries of earth were heard, the great hall of the Holy One, where the foundations rest on righteousness and the walls echo with peace. Here no lie can enter. Here no shadow hides. The archangels stood before the throne, not as accusers, but as witnesses. They spoke, not their own judgment, but presented what they had seen. The watchers who had left their station, the giants who devoured without mercy, the teachings that turned hearts to vanity and spells. They spoke of the prayers, the whispers of the broken, the trembling hopes of the forgotten. They spoke of the trees stripped bare, the rivers choked, the skies that wept rain without joy. And the Holy One listened. He did not rise in haste. He did not roar with wrath. He bowed his head as one who grieves before he acts. For every sin on earth is first a wound in heaven, and before the flood comes, there is always a tear. Then came the judgment, not born of rage, but of holy sorrow. The watchers would be bound, held beneath the mountains, cast into the shadows they themselves had summoned. Their children, the Nephilim, would fall, not by man's hand, but by divine decree. The earth would be cleansed, and yet, even in this, mercy shone. For in the midst of the world's corruption, there was still one who walked with God. One who listened when others shouted, one who remembered when others forgot. His name was Enoch, and now he would be called not only to write, but to speak. A messenger is chosen. Among the many there was one. He lived not in a palace nor among the giants. He did not seek fame, nor did he raise his voice in the streets. He walked quietly, steadily, humbly. His name was Enoch. From the 7th generation of Adam, Enoch had learned to walk close to the Lord. While others ran after power, he sought presence. While others desired the stars for control, he gazed upon them in worship. His heart was a scroll, and his life a pen. He wrote what was revealed. He recorded what was whispered in the silence. He observed the world, but did not follow it. He stood in the midst of corruption, yet remained untouched. And for this, heaven took notice. Enoch did not seek the roll, but the roll sought him. The Lord looked upon the earth and found so few. But he saw Enoch, and he called him, not to judge, but to carry the message of judgment, not to rule, but to witness, not to shout, but to speak with clarity and care. Enoch, the scribe of righteousness, would now become a messenger between realms. He would be taken, not by death, but by divine invitation, into the presence of the Holy One. He would see what others could not. He would hear what others dared not imagine. And he would return not with weapons, but with words. Words that would echo through time. Words that would pierce the veil between heaven and earth. Words soaked in light, heavy with truth, and tender with sorrow. The cry of the oppressed had reached heaven. The court had convened, the sentence was spoken, and now the messenger was chosen. A man who walked with God, and would now walk where no man had walked before. Chapter 7. The Summons of Enoch. There are moments in the story of a soul when heaven draws near, not with thunder, but with stillness. In the quiet places of the earth, where hearts remain soft and eyes are lifted in longing, the divine sometimes speaks. And so it was with Enoch. He was alone when they came, two radiant beings clothed not in armor, but in light. Their presence did not stir the ground or split the sky. It stilled the air. It softened time. Their steps made no sound, yet all of creation seemed to bow as they approached. Their garments glowed like early morning sun, and their eyes, like quiet flames, did not burn. They warmed. They carried no swords. They bore no seals of rank. Yet they were not of earth. They were angels, messengers from the dwelling place of the Most High. Enoch did not run. He did not fall in terror. For though his body trembled, his soul knew peace. He had walked with God, and now he was being called. "You are summoned," one of them spoke, voice like wind over still waters. "Not for your strength, not for your might, but for your heart. The Lord has chosen you, Enoch, son of Jared. You are to deliver his words." The other angel stepped forward, unscrolling something invisible, a command not written in ink, but inscribed in spirit. "You will go where others cannot. You will speak what others dare not. The judgment of heaven must be delivered, and you, scribe of righteousness, have been chosen." Enoch bowed, not from fear, but from awe, and heaven smiled. For among the noise of a corrupted world, one had listened, and now he would speak. The scribe of righteousness, Enoch, was not a king. He wore no crown, he commanded no army. But he was something far rarer, a man who walked with God in the midst of a world that had forgotten him. He had lived quietly, observing the days with reverence, keeping his steps aligned with the ways of holiness. While others chased power, he pursued presence. While many forgot the Maker, Enoch remembered. And so he had written, not for glory, but for truth. Not with ambition, but with obedience. Scrolls marked by the rhythm of righteousness, inked with reverence, held close like a flame in winter. His writings were gentle, yet clear. His words were soaked in listening. He did not speak quickly, And he did not speak loudly, but what he spoke was full of light. Now that same quiet man stood before angels. He was still flesh, still dust. But he was not ordinary, for he had been chosen to carry a burden only the holy could bear. You will stand before the fallen, the angel said. Those who once stood in glory now tremble beneath the weight of their rebellion. You will deliver what heaven has decreed. Their petitions shall be answered, and they shall not be heard. Enoch's hands trembled, not from doubt, but from the holiness of the task. He was no judge, yet he would carry judgment. He was not divine, yet he would speak words shaped by divinity. He did not boast. He did not protest. He bowed again and whispered, "Let it be done as he has said." And in that moment, he became the bridge between heaven's command and the earth's corruption, between angels who did not fall and angels who could not rise. He would walk paths never walked, speak truths long hidden, and do it all with the stillness of one who belonged not to earth nor heaven alone, but to God. To the watchers he spoke. Their prison was not one of iron nor of stone. It was deeper, darker, a silence beneath the earth, beneath the mountains, where even echoes do not return. The watchers who had once stood among stars now crouched in shadow. They had taught men to summon power. They had formed the giants. They had defied the boundary between heaven and earth. And now they waited, not in repentance, but in dread. They had sent their petitions upward, pleading for mercy, for a second chance, for the lifting of their sentence. Their voices had not reached the throne. They had only stirred the winds. And then came Enoch. He did not come with wrath. He did not come with vengeance. He came clothed in the quietness of truth. The watchers trembled as he approached, not because of his power, but because of what he carried. Enoch looked upon them, these radiant ones now dimmed by pride, and he spoke. "Your petitions have been heard," he said softly, "and they have been denied." The air grew still. No one spoke. You will not ascend again. You will not return to the presence you abandoned. Your place is no longer among the stars. It is here, beneath, until the appointed time. Some wept. Some grew silent. Others stared, as if their fall had finally reached their hearts. "There shall be no peace for you," Enoch continued. "No intercession shall be made. Your sentence is sealed." He did not shout. He did not scorn. He delivered what was given. Like a river carries the rain, and then he turned, and the watchers remained, cloaked not only in chains but in sorrow, the sorrow of those who had tasted heaven and could never return. A prophet between worlds Enoch had obeyed. He had walked where few dared to walk. He had stood between light and darkness, between the faithful and the fallen. And now the journey was not over. It had only begun. The angels came again, not as strangers, but as companions. Their faces shone, not with pride, but with peace. "Come," they said, "the Most High shall show you more." And Enoch was lifted, not in dream, not in vision, but in spirit and truth. He rose above the mountains. He passed over oceans and deserts, through veils of light and into realms not seen by mortal eyes. He traveled beyond the veil that separates earth from eternity. He saw the storehouses of wind, the chambers of stars, the rivers of fire. He saw angels who never fell, standing like sentinels of joy. He saw places where the righteous rest, gardens of peace, waters that sing, trees whose fruit never fades, and he saw the place of judgment, where the fallen wait, where silence holds its breath, where time folds into mystery. His reward was not silver, it was not gold, it was sight. God gave him eyes to see, not for his own glory, but so that the generations to come might remember that even in days of chaos, there was one who walked with the Almighty, one who stood firm when the earth trembled, one who listened when others turned away. And when his journey was complete, Enoch was not found, for the Lord took him, not in death, but in divine embrace. He was lifted, like a flame returning to the sun, and the scrolls he left behind still speak, soft as a whisper, strong as a trumpet. They remind us, when the world darkens, heaven still watches. When the cry rises, God still hears. And when one walks in righteousness, even angels come near. Chapter 8. The Prison of the Watchers. There are prisons fashioned not by human hands, not by walls of stone or bars of iron, but by the justice of heaven. These are places hidden from the eyes of men, sealed in the folds of the earth, where silence sits heavy and time does not move. In such a place were the watchers bound. They had descended in beauty, they had walked in power, but now, by the decree of the Most High, they were chained, not for a moment, but for ages. Azazel was chief among them. Proud in his wisdom, mighty in his rebellion. It was he who had taught men how to sharpen swords and stir envy with glittering stones. It was he who adorned corruption in gold, who dressed rebellion in robes of charm, and now he was buried. The command had gone forth from the throne, carried by the faithful ones, angels whose hands did not tremble. Azazel was taken to the wilderness, to a place of jagged rocks and shadows that swallowed sound. There, beneath the Dudael, he was cast. Stones sharp as judgment surrounded him. Darkness covered him like a garment. And the voice of God declared he would see no more light. It was not death. It was a deeper silence, a sentence not of fire, but of absence. No light, no voice, no way to rise again. This was the justice of heaven, not rushed, not cruel, but perfect. For Azazel had turned the hearts of men. He had taught the earth to forget its creator. And now he was forgotten, sealed in silence, beneath the gaze of stars that would never see him again. Pits of fire, and Mr. Azazel was not alone. Though other watchers, once clothed in radiance, were gathered like broken branches. They had once sung at creation's dawn. Now they howled at creation's pain. The judgment came, not as war, but as wind, as word, as will. The holy ones cast them into burning valleys, into deep caverns where fire does not comfort and mist does not cool. They cried out, not from torment alone, but from what had been lost. They had seen the face of God. They had stood in his courts. Now they were cast into places where no light could enter, where even memory became a burden too heavy to carry. Their names, once known in the songs of heaven, were now echoes of sorrow. They had taught the arts of enchantment, the twisting of roots and stars. They had led men to forget who had shaped them, and now they remembered, too late. No crown remained, no wing, no song, only flame and fog and silence. They pleaded, but no answer came, not because heaven could not hear, but because heaven had spoken. Their rebellion had cracked the order of creation. Their desires had opened doors never meant to be opened, and now justice sealed them shut. The caves closed with a soundless sigh, and the fallen ones wept. The spirits of their sons, the Nephilim, born of heaven's fall and earth's flesh, had walked the world with strength, but their strength did not last. They were not meant to endure, not in body, and so they perished. Their forms fell in battle, in hunger, in the judgment that followed, but their spirits did not pass on. They had no place to go. They were not of the earth, to return to dust. They were not of heaven, to return to light. They wandered, restless, rootless, without a home in the realm of the living, and unwelcome among the dead. These spirits, shaped by rebellion, became the shadows that moved through night, not in flesh but in whisper, not in body but in urge and echo. They became the tempters, the disturbers, the voices that stirred fear in the hearts of men. They became demons, not born in fire, but in fracture. They sought to enter, to influence, to dwell where they were not invited. And so they wandered, forever longing, forever lacking, forever lost. The world felt their presence, in the shiver of darkness, in the unrest of hearts, in the cruel whisper behind cruel thoughts. They were the sons of ruin, and ruin followed them. They were not to be worshipped. They were not to be welcomed. They were warnings that what begins in disobedience does not simply end, it echoes, even in silence, even in shadow. Guarded by the holy justice had been declared. The watchers had been bound. The Nephilim had fallen. But the work of heaven was not only to judge, it was to guard. The holy ones remained. Angels of light, loyal from the first breath of creation, now stood watch. Not with anger, not with pride, but with purpose. They watched the prisons, not to gloat, but to protect. They ensured the seals held, that the fires did not spread, that the mists remained in their bounds. Each place of punishment was kept in silence, but that silence was not abandoned, it was watched, for heaven does not forget. The faithful stood at the edges of those hidden places, swords lowered, faces calm, presence unmoved. They did not sleep, they did not speak, but they remained, and above all they remembered. For justice is not vengeance, it is the restoration of what is holy. It is the setting of order where chaos once ruled. It is the rebalancing of a world that had leaned too far into shadow. The angels, with hands that once helped shape stars, now stood at the borders of judgment, and the earth, beneath their gaze, beneath their prayer, began to heal. The grass grew again, the skies cleared. The hearts of men, though still fragile, began to feel hope, for when justice is kept, peace can return, and when heaven watches, the world can rest. Chapter 9. The Prophecy of the Flood. Before the storm, before the first drop fell, before even the clouds began to gather, there was a whisper in heaven, a name still unborn upon the earth, but already cradled in the heart of God. That name was Noah. Enoch was shown a vision, not of thunder or destruction, but of a man set apart. Among the swirling tide of rebellion, where hearts had grown deaf and the world heavy with sin, there would be one who still listened, one who still walked humbly, one who would be a vessel of mercy amid judgment. This man, Noah, had not yet taken his first breath, yet heaven already knew him. He would be a child of the soil, a tiller of ground, like Adam. But he would also be something more, a man whose life would carry a promise too large for one lifetime. He would be born into a world that had forgotten holiness, where laughter echoed from the lips of the corrupt, and the songs of angels had long faded from memory. And still, Noah would walk with God. He would not be loud. He would not lead armies or call down fire. He would build patiently, silently, in faith. Enoch, standing between realms, saw it, saw Noah's heart like a small flame against the gathering dark. And in that flame, heaven saw hope. God would not abandon the world, not even in its ruin. He would preserve one man, not for greatness, but for goodness. And in that unseen favor, a new beginning was already taking shape, for where others would fall, Noah would stand. The warning delivered, the angels, messengers of light, were sent not to punish, but to prepare. Their wings did not beat with rage, but with sorrow, for they carried not weapons, but a warning. The Most High had spoken, and his words were not of vengeance, but of cleansing. The earth groaned beneath the weight of what had been done. The Watchers had defiled its order. The Nephilim had trampled its peace. The spirits of the fallen stirred the hearts of men toward evil without end. Creation itself had begun to decay under the touch of corruption, but the Creator would not let it rot. He would renew it, and so the message came. The rain would fall, not a brief storm, but a great washing. The waters would rise and stretch over the mountains. Valleys would be filled, hills would vanish beneath waves, not to destroy for destruction's sake, but to begin again, Noah was told. In a whisper of divine clarity, in the stillness of his spirit, the warning was placed. The world he knew would not remain, but he would remain. If he listened, there would be no trumpet, no sign in the stars, only the soft voice of God in the heart of a faithful man. And Noah heard. Not with fear, but with reverence, he understood what few could. That when God moves to cleanse, it is not to harm, it is to heal. The flood would be the earth's deep breath, a baptism of sorrow from which new life would rise. Noah did not tremble, he obeyed. And heaven watched, not with delight in the coming storm, but with peace in the obedience of one who trusted. The ark of obedience in a quiet field, under skies still untouched by rain, Noah began to build. He was not a craftsman by trade. He was not guided by maps or mathematics. He built by faith, following the vision given from above, stroke by stroke, beam by beam. The ark took shape slowly. It did not rise with haste, nor did it shimmer with pride. It was not a monument. It was a vessel, a cradle of covenant. The people watched. They laughed. They scoffed. Why build when the sun still shines? Why prepare when the days remain long and dry? But Noah did not answer their scorn. He listened instead to the silence between the trees. He remembered the voice that had spoken within him. And he worked. Each plank was placed not with fear, but with trust. Each nail was a note in a song only heaven could hear. The ark was not a weapon. It was a womb. In a world of chaos, it would be the one place where peace was preserved. In a land of noise, it would carry the stillness of God's promise. He gathered the animals, not by command of nature, but by the order of grace. They came, 2 by 2, not in confusion, but in calm, drawn by the same voice that had summoned light from darkness, and when it was ready, the ark stood as a silent sermon, a testimony in wood and pitch that obedience, even in the absence of signs, is the highest form of worship. Noah had not seen the flood, but he believed the one who had, and that belief became his shelter. A year of cleansing, when the door was closed and the rain began to fall. It did not come as thunder at first. It came softly, like 1,000 tiny whispers falling from the sky. But soon the heavens opened and the deep surged upward to meet them. The flood did not last 40 days only. That was the beginning, but not the end. For a full year, the earth was held beneath water, not for wrath, but for washing. It was as if creation had been placed beneath a veil, hidden, kept, rocked gently in sorrow, and prepared for rebirth. Inside the ark, time moved slowly. The days passed not in fear, but in faith. Noah watched the rain as one might watch a sacred ritual, not knowing when it would end, but trusting that it would. Outside, the world was made quiet. The songs of violence, the cries of corruption, all silenced. The giants had fallen. The influence of the watchers was swept away, and in their place only water remained. Water that cleansed the blood from the soil. Water that softened the hardened ground. Water that healed the wounds left by centuries of sin, and then one day the rain ceased. The clouds began to lift. The dove flew. The mountain tops emerged, and the ark, that cradle of obedience, came to rest. When Noah stepped out, the earth smelled new. The silence was different, not heavy, but holy. And above him, stretching from sky to sky, was a bow of color, now a weapon, not a threat, but a promise, a covenant painted in light. God had cleansed. God had preserved. God had begun again, and he would remember. Not just Noah, but the world. Chapter 10. The Spirits that Wandered. The giants had fallen. Their bodies, once towering over fields and mountains, lay silent beneath the earth. Their strength had faded. Their breath had stilled. Their rebellion, brought forth from the union of heaven and earth, had been judged. But something remained. From the wreckage of their ruin, spirits rose, not in glory, not in peace, but in unrest. The Nephilim, born of disobedience, could not return to the dust as men do, nor could they rise to the heights where angels dwell. They were caught in between, suspended, untethered, cursed not in body, but in being. These spirits wandered, not because they chose to, but because they were not allowed to rest. They searched, not for light, but for presence, not for worship, but for control. And where they found emptiness, they entered. Where they found weakness, they fed. They were bitter. They were angry, not because they had been misunderstood, but because they had been judged. They did not weep for what they had lost. They longed only to return, to touch the world again, to move through flesh again, to whisper into the ears of men. And so they roamed through wilderness and city, over water and wind, always looking, always lacking. They were the leftover curse, the residue of rebellion, the consequence of a wound too deep to heal in one generation. And the earth, though cleansed by flood, still trembled with their presence. For these were not enemies of the body, they were tormentors of the soul. The rise of unclean spirits as time passed, the world forgot their names, but their influence remained. They did not build temples, they did not demand idols, they whispered, soft, unseen, persistent. Into thoughts they crept, into fear they fed, they sowed distrust, suspicion, rage and pride. Not as a storm, but as a shadow that lengthens with the setting sun. They were not demons by design. They were not created for evil. They had been born of error, of a joining that never should have been, and in that inheritance they carried corruption. They became the unclean spirits. They did not sleep. They did not love. They only lingered. At first, they stirred discomfort, the unease that wakes a soul before the dawn. Then they stirred doubt, the kind that silences prayer. And then came deeper things: deception, despair, destruction. They looked for the broken, not to heal, but to inhabit. They did not shout. They whispered, "You are alone. You are forgotten, you are unworthy." And many believed them. Possession was not always visible. Sometimes it came as thoughts that would not leave, sometimes as urges that felt too strong to resist, sometimes as a silence so loud it drowned out every promise. These spirits were not legion in number, but they moved like wind, unseen and everywhere. Yet even in their rise they were not victorious, they were loud. But they were not lasting. They were strong, but not sovereign. For every whisper they sent, heaven prepared a response, and the war, though unseen, had already begun. A battle unseen. This was not a war like those fought with swords and kings and cities laid to waste. This was a quieter war, deeper, older, a battle between presence and absence, between truth and whisper, between the stillness of God and the storm of chaos. The angels, those who had remained faithful from the beginning, were not withdrawn. They did not flee when man fell. They did not forget when prayers grew faint. They stood watch. And they moved, not always in fire, but in breath. Not always in vision, but in influence. They guided dreams. They brought messages. They stood beside the weary without being seen. They fought not with weapons, but with nearness. They brought clarity to confused minds. They steadied the hands of the righteous. They answered prayers before words had formed. In the dark corners where the unclean spirits sought to rule, The faithful angels brought light, not in brightness, but in warmth, the kind of light that pushes out fear without raising its voice. There were dreams sent to warn, moments of sudden peace amid terror. Whispers that reminded a person of their name, their hope, their God. These were not accidents, they were interventions. Every temptation was met with unseen resistance. Every deception was countered with hidden truth. And in the lives of the humble, the poor, the prayerful, the patient, the battle was won daily, not by their strength, but by the presence that never left them. For heaven had not only judged, it had stayed, and in staying, it had protected. The mercy that endures, the flood had washed the world. The watchers had been bound. The ark had come to rest, and still evil lingered, but so did mercy. For God's justice is not the end of the story. His mercy endures, not briefly, not in part, but in fullness. It covers what cannot be fixed. It binds what has been broken too long. It holds steady what would otherwise fall. The unclean spirits were allowed to wander, but they were not allowed to conquer. Their reach had a boundary. Their strength had a limit. Their power was held back by the hand that had formed the seas, the skies, and the stars. Where they sought to spread, God placed walls. Where they sought to reign, God placed shepherds. Prophets were raised, altars were built, covenants were spoken. And over time, though the world still knew shadow, it also remembered light. Every generation was given a chance. Every heart was still known. Even in the silence, God whispered back. Even in the chaos, God planted peace. The war between spirit and spirit still moved beneath the surface. But it did not end in despair, for every movement of darkness was matched and overcome by the mercy that endures. And one day, from that mercy, a greater promise would come, one not written in stars, but born beneath them, one not sealed in scrolls, but in flesh and blood, a Redeemer. But until then, the angels remained. The unclean spirits wandered, and mercy held the line. Chapter 11. The Parables of Enoch begin. The heavens opened to Enoch as softly as a veil drawn back by invisible hands. In his spirit he was lifted beyond the reach of clouds, beyond the turning of stars, into a realm where time no longer held sway. There, wrapped in eternal stillness, Enoch beheld a figure both strange and beautiful, a mystery resting beside the Ancient of Days. The figure was like a man, yet more radiant than any man born of earth. His face held both the warmth of mercy and the solemn strength of justice. His eyes seemed to hold the memory of every tear ever shed, and yet they looked forward with the light of hope. Enoch, though shaken, was not afraid. For the presence of this Son of Man brought peace even in the midst of awe. Around him, hosts of heaven were silent. They did not sing nor speak, for the moment was holy. The Son of Man sat beside the one who is beyond all names, ancient, everlasting, clothed in light that had no shadow. It was here, Enoch understood, that divine judgment was not wrathful or wild, but serene and perfect. The Son of Man would judge both the high angels and the lowly men. And he would do so not with a sword, but with a gaze that saw all things rightly. He would not be moved by riches nor flattered by words. The humble would be lifted, and the proud gently unmade. In the presence of the Son of Man, all pretense would fall away like dust from a garment. Truth alone would remain, and this truth, though sharp, would be healing. The throne of glory, Enoch's eyes were drawn to the place from which all light seemed to pour. There stood the throne, not made of gold or stone, not carved by hands or imagined by minds, but alive with fire and crystal. It was a living seat, not cold and still, but breathing with purity. It was as though the holiness of the Creator had taken form, resting like a heartbeat in the center of all things. Beneath the throne flowed rivers, not of water, but of flame, soft and endless, winding like molten silk across the floor of heaven. They did not burn with destruction, but with cleansing light, like the dawn that melts away shadows. This was the fire that tested hearts and refined souls. Not all could stand before it. From this throne, judgment flowed, not as a hammer falls, but as a light reveals. No word was wasted. No glance was mistaken. Every soul stood as it truly was. No masks, no veils. And yet there was no cruelty in this seeing, only truth and a mercy deeper than any ocean. Around the throne, the multitudes waited. They did not tremble in fear, but in reverence. The air shimmered with the presence of what cannot be named. Angels bowed not in dread, but in love. And the Son of Man, seated in stillness, watched with eyes that understood both pain and promise. Enoch could not move. He could not speak. He simply beheld. For what words could describe a throne that glowed with living glory and passed judgment not through rage, but through radiant justice? Kings cast down. Then the vision shifted. Enoch saw the great ones of the earth, kings, princes, mighty rulers brought before the throne. No armies stood with them. No banners waved in their defense. Their crowns, which once sparkled with stolen jewels, now melted into ash. Their robes, once heavy with splendor, grew threadbare in the presence of the Son of Man. These were they who had built kingdoms on the backs of the weak. They had written laws for their own gain and raised temples to their own names. They had spoken over others with the voice of power, never hearing the cries that rose beneath them. And now, before the throne of glory, their deeds were laid bare. There was no shouting, no condemnation hurled from above. Only the quiet weight of truth. And it was more terrible than thunder. The rulers trembled, not from fear alone, but from recognition. They saw with sudden clarity the ruin they had sown, the broken homes, the silenced voices, the injustice that had once passed unnoticed. And they wept, not because they had been caught, but because they could no longer lie to themselves. But judgment was not a punishment for its own sake. It was a setting right. What had been crooked would be made straight. What had been high and hollow would be brought low and filled with meaning. The earth had called these men powerful, but heaven did not see as the earth sees. The fire of the throne did not honor the crowns of men. It searched their hearts, and where there had been pride, it brought humility. Where there had been cruelty, it offered silence. Where there had been lies, it uncovered truth. And so the kings were cast down, not violently, but by the sheer weight of holiness, the comfort of the righteous. And then Enoch saw another multitude, so different from the first. These were not dressed in finery. They did not walk with the proud stride of royalty. They were the quiet ones, the faithful, the forgotten. And yet in the court of heaven they shone like the morning. Their names were written, not on scrolls that faded, nor in books that burned, but in light. A light so gentle it felt like the hand of God resting on the soul. These were the ones who had been overlooked on earth, mocked, dismissed, pushed aside. But here they were celebrated. The throne did not burn them. It welcomed them. The Son of Man rose to meet them, not with a sword, but with open arms. And Enoch saw that their tears had not been wasted. Each sorrow had been counted. Each prayer, no matter how quiet, had been heard. The trials they endured had not gone unnoticed. The pain that others ignored had been carried by heaven. And now their reward was not gold, but presents. Not crowns, but closeness. They did not need thrones, for they were seated in peace. They did not need applause, for they were known. Every wound had been turned into wisdom. Every hardship had become a step toward glory. A place had been prepared for them, not at the edge of things, but at the heart. They did not need to ask, "Am I welcome here?" For the very gates had been opened in their honor. Enoch watched as the righteous entered into joy. And it was not a loud joy, it was soft, sacred, like the sound of water on stone, or wind in the trees, or a child falling asleep in the arms of love. In this vision, Enoch saw the full shape of justice, not as punishment, but as restoration. The wicked were unmasked, the powerful made low, and the meek lifted up in light. And through it all, the Son of Man remained, the calm in the storm, the fire at the center, the judge who judges in love. And Enoch, though still only a man, felt the peace of eternity brush against him. He would carry this vision, not as a burden, but as a promise. For what he had seen was not merely the end of wickedness, but the beginning of everlasting comfort. And in that comfort he rested. Chapter 12. The First Heaven and Beyond. The journey continued, and Enoch walked no longer with feet of flesh, but was carried in spirit by the hand of the angel Uriel. Upward they rose, past the whispering winds of the morning sky, beyond the reach of cloud and light. There, like layers upon layers of folded glory, stood the seven heavens, realms not bound by earth's rhythm, but ordered in holiness. The first heaven shimmered like the surface of still water, kissed by the sunrise. Gentle spirits moved there, messengers of peace, singing praises that echoed softly like distant flutes. It was a place of beginning, where prayers first touched eternity. Above it lay the second, veiled in a hue of sapphire, filled with angels who guarded the paths of the righteous. Here nothing entered without purity. It was like a chamber of refining silence, where intentions were weighed before taking flight. The third heaven opened with a golden breeze. Fields of light spread wide, where the souls of the faithful waited in peace, resting in God's memory. Their laughter was like the rustling of olive trees, soft and full of life. In the fourth, Enoch beheld the movements of the sun and moon. Their paths were not random nor distant. but carefully traced by the will of God. Each orb moved like a living servant, obedient and steady. The fifth heaven pulsed with the breath of song. Choirs of angelic voices filled it, not as a performance, but as a way of being. The melodies held no end, looping like the wind through mountains, always returning, always new. The sixth heaven held watchers of time and seasons. Great tablets glowed with records, births, deaths, the rising of nations, the falling of empires. Every moment of Earth's story was seen and written, not with judgment, but with clarity. And then the seventh. Enoch was silent before it. Light flowed not as beams, but as rivers. He felt himself unmade and remade by its presence. Here dwelled the highest, enthroned beyond all thrones. It was not a place of fear, but of rest. All was still. All was full, Uriel spoke gently. These are not layers to be climbed, but revelations of holiness. Each heaven reveals more of God's order, more of his nearness. And Enoch, though overwhelmed, was not afraid, for even in the highest heights he felt the same peace that moved through the leaves on earth. The heavens were not distant, they were near, and they were filled with love. The chambers of the elements, Uriel led him on, and Enoch's vision turned toward the storehouses of creation. In a realm where space did not confine and time did not dictate, he saw doors open into the mysteries of the earth. First was the chamber of snow. Vast and silent, it stretched like a white sea, untouched and waiting. Snowflakes hung in stillness, each one uniquely crafted, as if God had kissed every edge with his breath. Here, snow did not fall by accident. It was released by command. Next came the storehouse of wind. It roared with softness, a paradox of power held in peace. The winds waited behind veils, obedient until their moment. They were not wild things, but spirits of movement, keepers of balance. North winds, east winds, warm breezes, and storm gales all knew their hour. Then came the chamber of thunder. Unlike the rumbling of earthly storms, this thunder was sacred, each boom a word spoken by heaven. It echoed with meaning, not menace. Bolts of light waited in silence, lined like spears of truth, ready not to destroy but to awaken. Uriel showed him the chamber of dew, where droplets shimmered like tiny stars. Dew was not merely moisture, it was a tender blessing, a silent kiss from God upon the earth in the stillness of night. The chamber of hail stood vast, filled with frozen stones, resting in calm. Their moment would come, and they would serve their purpose, never early, never late. Enoch saw that nothing in creation was random. Every element had a keeper. Every storm had a timing. The chaos of weather, so feared by man, was actually a symphony, played with divine precision. Uriel said, "The Lord has not abandoned his creation to chance. All things are stored, measured, and released in wisdom." And Enoch wept, not from sadness, but from awe. Even the winds were not forgotten. Even the snow knew its time. Stars as living witnesses, Uriel turned Enoch's gaze to the sky, not as he had known it, but as it truly was. The stars that once seemed like distant fires were now revealed as living beings, vast, radiant, and assigned. Each star had a name, and each name had a purpose. They were not aimless points in a great void, but watchmen, witnesses of the earth below. They moved with reverence, circling in rhythms only the heavens could hear. Uriel whispered, "These are the hosts of light. They sing the calendar of God." The stars kept track of seasons and signs, of sacred times and holy nights. They blinked, not randomly, but with intention, sentinels in the sky, declaring divine mysteries. But not all had remained faithful. Enoch was shown the stars that had transgressed, those who had stepped out of their appointed paths, who had followed pride instead of purpose. These were not stars as man imagines, but celestial beings, once radiant, now fallen. They were cast into deep pits, dark and silent. No light reached them. Their song was silenced. Imprisoned until the end of days, they were reminders that even the heavens had laws. Enoch trembled, not from fear, but from reverence. For the sky he had once thought was empty was now full, alive with obedience and history. Uriel continued, "All creation watches, all creation listens. The stars are not blind, they are witnesses to the covenant." And Enoch understood. The heavens were not decoration, they were testimony. He looked up, and every constellation became a scripture. Every light a living reminder of God's order. A map written in light. At last Uriel unfolded before Enoch a vision like no other. It was not a scroll, yet it read like one. It was not a painting, yet it showed more than image. It was a map, written in light, a woven tapestry of the cosmos. The sun, the moon, the stars, the winds, all moved in harmony. Time was not merely hours and seasons, but a holy rhythm. The movements of the heavens were a calendar of God's intentions. Festivals, rains, births, and harvests, everything was marked upon this living design. The constellations were not myths. They were symbols. They told the story of creation, the path of redemption, the promise of return. Even the turning of shadows at dusk was part of a deeper language, an alphabet of glory. Enoch's heart swelled. He saw the great wheel of heaven moving, not fast, not slow, but in peace. There were no accidents, no forgotten moments. Everything was known, and every life was seen. Uriel spoke once more. "This is the fabric of all things. What appears as chaos to man is a hidden order. God's wisdom is not loud, it is quiet like stars moving on cue." And Enoch felt small, but not in despair. He felt small like a child held in the arms of one who sees everything. The world below was not forgotten. The heavens above were not silent. Enoch had been shown the 7 heavens, the chambers of the elements, the living stars, and the sacred map that held it all. He did not need to understand it all. It was enough to know that everything moved by God's hand. As the vision faded and Enoch's spirit began to return, he carried the peace of that order with him, a peace that whispered, "God is near, God is wise, and all things, seen and unseen, are held in his light." Chapter 13. The Fallen Stars and the Law of Light. The vision opened again before Enoch, not as thunder nor flame, but with a whisper of sorrow. In the stillness of the heavenly realm, he was shown that even the stars, as radiant as they were, held not only beauty, but responsibility. They were not lights for decoration alone, but beings with roles, paths, and purpose. And in that sacred order, some had wandered. Uriel stood beside Enoch, his voice calm as he revealed the grief, of the high heavens. Not all stars kept their course, he said. Some, once bright, defied the way they were made. These were not merely falling stars as seen from Earth, but living ones, angels who were assigned to watch, to guide, to sing the order of the sky. Yet in their freedom, some chose pride over purpose. They turned from the harmony of heaven's song and sought to write a melody of their own. Their rebellion was not fire and battle, but misalignment. A gentle shift at first, like a single note sung out of time. Yet that dissonance rippled outward. What had been unity began to bend. What had been peace began to tremble, and so the stars that rebelled were cast down, not in fury, but in divine correction. It was not punishment for revenge, but discipline for restoration. For even in the justice of God there is no chaos, only mercy with a firm hand. As they fell, their light dimmed. Once brilliant, they became echoes of what was. Their fall broke. No thunder, but the heavens mourned all the same. Enoch watched with reverence, for in this vision he saw not wrath, but the ache of love when a child strays. The stars had sinned, not by fire, but by forgetting who they were, and in forgetting they brought disorder to the rhythm of heaven. The pit without flame. Uriel turned Enoch's vision to a place beneath the heavens, not into the fires of wrath, but into a deep stillness. It was a pit without flame, without sound. A prison not of punishment, but of silence. Here the fallen stars were bound, each within their own darkness. Their light was removed, their brilliance extinguished, but their presence remained like hollow lanterns that once burned brightly, but now sat still and cold. They were not tormented, yet neither were they free. Time did not pass here as it did on earth. There was only waiting, long, unending waiting, the kind of waiting that teaches, that remembers. Enoch did not see rage in their forms. He saw sorrow. Not the sorrow of a judge, but of the judged. Their glory had been a gift, but it had not been guarded. And now their silence bore witness to the truth. Even the highest can fall, and yet, even in this pit, there was no hatred from God, no mocking voice, only the silence of holiness, firm, clear, and still. Uriel spoke, "They are bound until the time of restoration, until the order is complete again." And Enoch, moved with quiet fear, saw that the pit was not a place of fire, but of lesson, a place where pride met stillness, where fallen light waited not to be erased, but to be remembered. The memory of the fallen stars echoed in the air like a quiet psalm. Not sung, but felt. A holy reminder. Light is not immune to pride, and those who shine must do so not for themselves, but for the one who placed them in the sky. A law that never breaks. Then the vision shifted once more. Uriel lifted his hand, and before Enoch stretched the great order of creation, not just what could be seen, but what was hidden beneath the surface of all things, a law not carved in stone, but etched into time itself. Heaven, Enoch saw, was not built upon force, but upon rhythm. Everything moved with balance. The sun knew its path. The moon knew its turning. The seasons came not by accident, but by design. There was a pulse to creation, a sacred breath that filled every star, every Wave every seed, Uriel spoke. This is the law of light. It is not chained in scrolls, but flows through the veins of all things. Obedience was not control, it was harmony. It was the tree bending to the wind, not breaking. The river following its bed, not wandering. The morning rising at its hour, not rushing ahead. And in this order there was peace. Enoch saw angels recording time, not like human scribes, but like guardians of balance. They did not tally moments with numbers, but with purpose. When the wind moved, they knew why. When the rains fell, they knew where. Nothing was lost to chance, nothing forgotten. Even the creatures of the earth moved by this law. Birds followed the wind's memory. Beasts traveled with the turning of the year. Flowers opened not only to the sun, but to the silent music of heaven. The stars that had fallen had broken this law, not by force, but by refusing to flow with it. And their fall had shown that even light, when removed from order, could bring shadow. But this divine law never broke. It waited unwavering, like a path through the forest, always there for those who sought it. And Enoch, with eyes wide and heart full, knew that this law was not distant. It was close. It beat within his own breath, whispered in his own footsteps. A holy design waiting to be followed. The sky that speaks. Enoch turned his gaze upward again, and this time he did not see mere stars or sun or moon. He saw sermons written in radiance. He saw the voice of God, not as thunder, but as sunrise. Each dawn was a word, each nightfall a sentence of peace. The sky did not shout, but it spoke, clearly, continually, faithfully. The phases of the moon were like verses in a sacred song. The waxing and waning told of time, of patience, of cycles that bring both growth and rest. The moon was not only a light by night, it was a teacher of waiting, of humility, of gentleness. The sun, rising in its strength, declared the faithfulness of the one who made it. Never once had it failed to rise. Never once had it forgotten its way. It did not boast, but it endured. Its heat was not for harm, but for blessing. The stars, so many, so silent, were not distant. They watched, they remembered, and they reminded those who looked up that they too had a place in the story of creation. Uriel spoke softly. The heavens declare his glory, not just in beauty, but in order, not just in light, but in truth. Enoch felt the truth in his bones. Every time the sky shifted, it was not random. It was a message, a gentle sermon painted in hues of gold and silver, blue and deep velvet black. Even the silence between stars was filled with purpose. Even the darkest night carried the promise of dawn. Heaven spoke not to the ear, but to the heart, and to those who listened, every cloud became a verse, every breeze a blessing. Enoch bowed his head, not from fear, but from fullness, for he had heard the sermon of the sky, he had seen the law of light, he had wept for the fallen stars, and he had rejoiced in the order that remained. He knew now that creation was not a machine, but a choir, not a system, but a sanctuary. And in that sanctuary every soul had a song. And so, as the vision faded, and the silence of rest returned, Enoch rested too. Not with questions, but with peace. For the heavens had spoken, and the Word was light. Chapter 14. The Dream of Beasts and Kingdoms. In the stillness of night, when the world below lay wrapped in shadows and silence, Enoch received a dream unlike any before. It came softly, not as a storm, but as a quiet unfolding, gentle, sacred, and full of hidden meaning. In the vision, the shapes of men faded, and in their place arose creatures of pasture and wild field. There, in a vast and quiet meadow, Enoch beheld the world not as it seemed, but as it truly moved beneath the surface. Bulls and sheep walked among tall grasses. They were the people of the earth, each one living, breathing, chosen. They grazed in peace, their steps slow and unafraid. The sheep stayed close to one another, and their wool shone white beneath a golden sky. The bulls stood strong and vigilant, watching the edges of the field. But time passed in the dream, and the herds began to scatter. From the edge of the plain, lions crept in, powerful, silent. Eagles swooped low from distant peaks. Wolves lingered in shadow. They did not come with peace. They came to devour, to conquer, to lead astray. The once peaceful herds were chased, scattered, wounded. The bulls fought bravely, but they were few. The sheep, without guide or guardian, wandered blindly into dark valleys. Some followed the lions. Others were snatched away by hawks with steel claws. What had been a pasture became a battlefield. Still the vision remained calm. Enoch was not afraid, though his heart ached. For this was not just a tale of animals, it was the story of nations. A quiet parable of kingdoms and peoples, of rulers and followers. In this meadow lay the rise and fall of empires. In these beasts lived the hope and sorrow of all mankind. Enoch watched, and he understood. This dream was not a fable. It was a mirror. And through it, the eyes of his soul were opened. The fall and the shepherds. The meadow faded into hills, and among them new figures appeared, tall, bright, clothed in quiet light, the shepherds. They were not of the earth, but from the heavens. Angels appointed by God to tend the sheep, to guard them from harm, to lead them toward peace. They carried staffs not made of wood, but of promise. They were meant to be protectors, watchmen, voices of guidance in the silence. At first, they moved among the flocks with care, watching the paths, mending the broken, lifting the weak. The sheep trusted them, followed them. But slowly, something changed. Some shepherds grew careless. Their eyes drifted from the fields. They watched the skies but missed the wolves below. Others turned inward, forgetting the sheep altogether. And some, though meant to protect, joined the beasts. They let lions enter the gates. They whispered with the hawks. They became guides of deception rather than light. Enoch wept in his dream, for the flocks cried out. Their voices rose like wind across the hills, not in anger, but in pain. The meadow had become a wilderness, and the shepherds, meant to reflect the love of heaven, had failed. Uriel's voice came then, soft as wind through olive branches. Even the watchers shall be judged, for those entrusted with light must not walk in shadow. Justice was coming, not with thunder, but with quiet certainty. The shepherds would be called to account. Every lamb lost, every voice ignored, every path left unguarded would be remembered. The field was no longer just a place of animals. It had become the stage where heaven's trust had been tested and too often broken. Still the dream held peace, for in every failure a promise remained. God sees. And what is seen by God is never forgotten. The scroll of the count. As the vision deepened, a great stillness settled. From the center of the field, where the grasses no longer grew, a book rose, tall, shining, sealed in gold. It hovered in the air before Enoch, its pages moving without hands. This was no earthly scroll. It bore no ink, no parchment. It was light and voice and memory all at once. Uriel said, "This is the ledger of the Lord, the scroll of the count." Within its sacred pages was written the number of the sheep. Not just numbers, but names, not merely statistics, but souls. Each life known, each one accounted for. Not a single sheep had vanished without being written. Not one lamb was unseen, even those taken by wolves, even those who wandered in darkness. Their names glowed faintly in the book, not in condemnation, but in remembrance. For though they had strayed, they were not erased. The scroll bore the full story of birth and choice, of loss and longing. It was not a book of judgment alone, but of love, a record not to punish, but to restore. Enoch saw that nothing had escaped the eye of the shepherd who never sleeps, and then, from the margins of the scroll, new names began to glow, those not yet born, those yet to awaken. The future was not blank, it was held. The count was not merely past, it was unfolding. Enoch bowed low, for in this dream he saw the truth the earth so often forgot. Every life matters, every soul is sacred, every lamb belongs. And in the quiet turning of the pages, he heard the heartbeat of heaven. The ram who would rise, the field, though wounded and scarred, was not without hope. And as Enoch looked across the weary land, he saw movement on the horizon. At first, it was only a shadow, still and distant, but soon it grew. A single ram stepped forward, his horn great and shining, like polished silver beneath the morning light. This was no ordinary creature. The other animals paused, their cries stilled. Even the wolves fell silent. For this ram walked not with pride, but with purpose. His steps restored the ground. Where he passed, the grass grew green again. He did not roar or command. He simply came, and with him came peace. Enoch watched as the scattered sheep turned their heads. The blind began to see. The lost found their steps. The frightened found courage. It was not magic. It was presence. The ram did not drive them. He led them. The angels above looked on. The scroll glowed brighter. Uriel's voice was soft but sure. This is the one sent from above. He will gather what was scattered. He will awaken what was sleeping. He will return what was lost. The ram lifted his horn, and light poured from it, not blinding but warm. It wrapped around the sheep like a cloak, a promise. He moved through them not as ruler, but as guardian, not to conquer, but to restore. Enoch saw the pastures shift. The meadow became whole again. The beasts fled, the flocks gathered, and the field, once broken, sang once more. This vision, though dream, was more than image. It was prophecy. The ram was coming, not in force, but in faithfulness, not in wrath, but in love. And Enoch, though still dreaming, felt more awake than ever. He had seen the story of the nations in animals, the fall of shepherds, the memory of the scroll, and the rise of a holy one. And in the hush of that vision's end, he rested, not in fear, but in hope. Chapter 15, The Son of Man Revealed. The vision came upon Enoch like a river of light, flowing not from above nor below, but from beyond time itself. In this sacred stillness, where no shadow dared to linger, he was lifted once more, not in body, but in spirit, to behold a mystery hidden since before the foundation of the world. There stood a figure, radiant and calm, not forged from the dust of the earth, but shining with the brightness of eternity. Enoch could not name him at first, for his presence was unlike any other, yet in his soul he knew. This was the Son of Man, not a man crowned by men, but one whose name was known before the stars, before the seas, before even the breath of creation stirred the air. He did not stand beneath the Ancient of Days, nor before him like a servant. He stood beside him, sharing his glory, his throne, his timeless light. The brilliance that surrounded the Ancient One now poured also from the Son of Man, not borrowed, but native, not given as reward, but revealed as truth. Uriel's voice whispered beside Enoch, "He is the chosen one, not chosen from men, but chosen before all worlds. He is the delight of heaven, the image of the invisible. The heavens bent in quiet reverence. The stars seemed to lean closer, not with curiosity, but in worship. The Son of Man did not speak, yet all of heaven listened. His silence was not absence. It was presence so full, so perfect, that words would only lessen it. And in that holy silence, Enoch understood. This one had always been. Before mountains rose or rivers ran, before angels sang or men walked, the Son of Man was there, hidden in glory, waiting for the time appointed by the Father. He was not revealed through conquest. He did not emerge through fire. He stood steady as morning, patient as light. And now, in Enoch's vision, he was seen, not for the first time, but as he had always been, judge of the mighty. As Enoch watched, the scene shifted, not with violence, but like dawn, turning gently toward day. The Son of Man remained on his throne beside the Ancient of Days, but now before him gathered the rulers of the earth, the mighty of nations, those who once held scepters and issued decrees. Kings and commanders, clothed once in pride, now knelt in silence. Their crowns lay fallen at their feet, their garments no longer rich, but plain. They had come not by invitation, but by the inescapable summons of eternity. The Son of Man did not raise his voice. He did not move in wrath. He simply looked, and in that gaze all was known. Their deeds unfolded before him like scrolls unrolling in wind, words they had spoken in secret, choices they had hidden, the weights they placed on the shoulders of the poor, the laughter they offered when justice cried out. All of it stood exposed, not with cruelty, but with light that refused to be deceived. Some wept, Some lowered their heads. Others tried to speak, but their words turned to dust. For there was no defense before the one who sees all. This was not judgment as man imagines, loud, harsh, destructive. It was judgment as heaven delivers, steady, final, right. Uriel's voice was gentle, yet firm. Now justice is no longer delayed. What was hidden is revealed. What was high is humbled. Enoch saw that power on earth had been but a shadow, and now in the presence of the true king, all shadows faded. No bribe could be offered, no title remembered. Only truth remained. And yet, even here, the face of the Son of Man did not twist in anger. His justice was not vengeance, it was restoration, a setting right, a divine reckoning in which every soul was seen for who they truly were. The proud were silent, the heavens were still, and the throne stood firm, bathed in light, the light of the righteous. But not all who stood before the throne trembled. From the edges of the gathering, another multitude approached, quieter, gentler, shining not with their own light, but with a reflection of the one they followed. These were the faithful, the humble, the meek, the ones who had trusted God. Through long nights and weary days, their faces bore the marks of earthly pain, but also the peace of heavenly promise. And when the Son of Man looked upon them, his face was joy. They did not come to be judged, but to be welcomed. Their names were not hidden in books, but written in light, shining on the air itself. As they drew near, their burdens fell away. The sorrows they had carried for lifetimes dissolved in the warmth of his presence. Enoch watched as their faces began to glow, not with fire, but with radiance. They looked at him, and in his eyes they saw the fulfillment of every hope, every prayer, every aching silence they had endured. They were home. They were not many by the world's count. Few had ruled, fewer still were honored. But in the courts of heaven they were treasured. Their quiet kindness, their unseen sacrifices, their unwavering faith, all of it had been seen. All of it had mattered, and now before the throne they shone like the sun, Uriel whispered. They are the blessed, the ones who held to truth when truth cost everything. The ones who forgave, the ones who waited. And Enoch wept, not from sorrow, but from the beauty of what he saw. The Son of Man smiled, and the skies were filled with song. No instruments played, but the sound was everywhere. In the wind, in the stars, in the very ground beneath the feet of the righteous. They had not earned glory. They had walked in grace. And now grace had welcomed them home, the kingdom without end. And then came the final vision, not of ending, but of beginning. The Son of Man, enthroned in glory beside the Ancient of Days, now stretched forth his hand, not to conquer, but to renew, not to destroy, but to make whole. A new age began, one not marked by rising empires or falling thrones, but by the reign of peace. The heavens poured forth their blessing, and the earth responded like a garden kissed by spring rain. Mountains bowed low, rivers sang again, nations no longer waged war, for their swords had been reshaped into instruments of planting, of healing, of joy. The Son of Man ruled, not from palaces, but from hearts. His wisdom was not written in scrolls alone, but in the lives of those who walked in his light. Children laughed without fear, elders spoke with peace, and every breath on earth echoed heaven's song. This kingdom was not built by the hands of men. It came not from conquest or force. It was birthed from eternity, woven from compassion, established in glory. Uriel spoke once more. This is the kingdom without end, not a dream, but the final truth. And Enoch, beholding it, felt the fullness of time rest upon him like a gentle cloak. The visions, the journeys, the words, all had led to this. He saw that the story was not of wrath, but of restoration. Not of condemnation, but of homecoming. The Son of Man, once hidden, was now revealed, and his light would never fade. Chapter 16. The Second Death and the Valley of Fire. There are places where the wind stills, where the stars do not shine, and where time ceases to speak its quiet rhythm. In one such place, Enoch was taken, not by force, but by the quiet leading of the angel Uriel, who walked always with peace, even when the vision turned dark. Before them opened a valley, vast, scorched, and silent. Its edges glowed with embers, yet no breeze stirred the heat. It was not chaos, it was stillness, yet not the kind that comforts. It was the stillness of judgment, of finality. The flames did not roar, they moved like breath, steady, endless. They were not earthly flames, but a fire from beyond time, born of the holiness of God. It did not burn as man understands burning. It unveiled, it separated, it revealed. Uriel whispered, "This is the place of the second death, where those who rejected the light are gathered. It is not punishment born of rage, but of truth." Enoch's soul trembled, but not in fear, in awe, for here was the justice of heaven laid bare, without pretense or delay. The valley was not hidden from God. It was within his sight, sustained by his will, governed by his order. Those who entered it did not stumble unknowingly. They had chosen, over days and years, to walk away from light, from mercy, from the voice of God. They had followed only themselves, building empires of pride that now crumbled in silence. And here, in this valley, beyond time, they remained. Not by force, but by consequence. Time itself seemed to stand still, as if it could not move forward here. For the choices made in life now bore their full weight, and Enoch, though wrapped in peace, understood. This place was not forgotten, it was part of the story. Not all death ends. There is a death that comes to all, quiet, physical, like a breath that leaves and does not return. But what Enoch saw now was not that death. It was deeper, more final. It did not touch the body alone, it touched the soul. This was the second death. It was not a blaze of wrath, but the ache of separation. A grief deeper than any flame. Those who had walked away from love now felt what they had left behind, not in anger, but in absence. Here there was no light. Not because God could not reach, but because the soul had turned away. They had closed the door with every cruel word, every rejected mercy, every hardened choice. And now the light was outside, and they remained within their own silence. The torment was not screams. It was remembering. Remembering every moment when love had called, and they had not listened. Remembering the warmth they had once felt, and now no longer could. Not because it was taken, but because it was refused. Uriel's voice was like water on stone. This is not a punishment imposed. It is the harvest of a life without God. This death is not fire. It is separation from light, from hope, from the voice that once whispered through every sunrise. Those in the valley were not mocked. They were not taunted. They were simply seen as they were, as they had become. And the pain was not inflicted. It arose from within, from the soul's own cry. And yet, even here, Enoch saw the truth of heaven. Nothing was done in haste. Every life had been weighed with patience. Every heart had been called many times. The second death was not cruel. It was holy. It was the final echo of a life spent walking away from the light that had always followed. And Enoch wept, not for the fire, but for the silence. The angels who punish, then Enoch saw them. The ones who moved among the flames, not as prisoners, but as servants of heaven, angels of judgment, clothed in light that flickered like fire, with faces that held no malice, only purpose. They walked with reverence, not anger. Their hands did not strike, but upheld. For theirs was not the task of vengeance, but of balance. They ensured that what was bent would not remain so, that what was unjust would not endure forever. These were not executioners. They were restorers of order, instruments of holiness. Enoch saw that even here, in the valley of fire, nothing was outside the design of heaven. The angels did not gloat. They mourned, yet they did not falter. For their task was sacred, to carry out what was written, to uphold what had been declared. Uriel said softly, "They are the keepers of justice. They do not delight in what they do, but they serve, and what they serve is righteousness." Their presence brought no comfort to those in the valley, for those had rejected comfort. But their presence kept the fire from becoming chaos. It remained a place of purpose, not torment for its own sake. Even in judgment, heaven does not forget mercy, and Enoch saw it. The mercy was in the order, in the restraint, in the measured justice that did not rush to condemn, but waited until all had been revealed. The angels did not speak. They moved in silence, and their silence carried the weight of all truth. They were holy, not because they punished, but because they obeyed. And Enoch knew justice in heaven is not the opposite of love. It is its fulfillment, the choice that remains. But then, as the vision drew to a close, Enoch heard something unexpected. A sound not of fire, nor weeping, nor silence. It was a call. Soft like the morning breeze. Steady like the voice that spoke to Elijah on the mountain. It did not come from the valley. It came from beyond it, from the world of the living. Uriel turned to Enoch, and his face held hope. The door has not yet closed. For those who breathe, the path remains. And suddenly the valley was not the end. It was a warning, a signpost for the living, not to terrify, but to awaken, not to paralyze with fear, but to draw hearts back to love. For those who walk the earth still have a choice: to seek the light that always waits, to open their hearts to the mercy that never fades, to walk with God while there is still time. The second death is real, but so is the promise of life, and Enoch, as he returned from the vision, carried with him not despair, but invitation. For even in the shadow of judgment, the voice of the shepherd still calls to forgive, to return, to listen. The fire burns, but the path remains, and heaven is not far. Its gates are still open, its hands still stretched wide, and so Enoch rested, not in fear, but in faith. For the light was still shining, the voice still calling, and the choice still remained. Chapter 17, The Resurrection of the Righteous. The vision opened gently, like morning light passing through the folds of a curtain. Enoch was carried once more, not to the heights of fire or the depths of judgment, but to a place of soft wonder, a realm bathed in peace. Before him stretched a garden, not of earth, yet full of life. The trees swayed not in the wind, but in response to unseen music. Their leaves shone like emerald flame, their branches arched like prayer. The soil beneath was neither dry nor damp, but perfect, and from every root rose stillness, the kind that speaks of peace fulfilled. Birdsong floated in the air, sweet and unhurried. Rivers ran clear as glass, winding softly between fields of golden grain and lilies. There were no thorns, no decay, no shadows out of place. The air itself was holy. "This," said Uriel, "is where the righteous rest, not in silence, but in promise." And Enoch looked and saw them, men and women, children and elders, walking through the garden without burden, without pain. Their faces bore the memory of life, but not its sorrow. They were not asleep, but awake in a new way, awakened into the waiting peace of God. They walked slowly, hand in hand. Some sat beneath trees, speaking quietly. Others sang, their voices low like lullabies. They were not anxious. They were not waiting for rescue. They were already home. Here, death had not ended their story. It had merely brought them into the place that had been prepared for them, the garden beyond the grave. And Enoch, though not among them, felt his soul breathe. For this garden was not distant, it was near, it was real, and it waited for all who walked in the light. The Book of Life. Beyond the garden, past the flowering hills and the fields of rest, stood a throne, not made of gold or stone, but formed of light, and before it lay a book, resting gently on what seemed like air. It was not large, but it glowed with a warmth that reached Enoch's heart the moment he beheld it. Uriel spoke in a whisper, as though even angels bowed their voices near it. "This is the Book of Life." Its pages were not parchment, but layers of living light, each one holding names, not just written, but alive. Names that shimmered, names that called, names that could never be erased. These were the ones who had walked in love when love was costly, who had remained humble when the world prized pride, whose prayers had risen in the quiet hours when no one saw. Their steps had been slow, their burdens often heavy, but they had not let go of the hand of God, and now they were remembered. Not in part, but fully. Their stories were written not in ink, but in gold, each moment of faith recorded, each act of mercy honored. Enoch looked, and he knew. Not one soul had been overlooked. Not one tear had been forgotten. The names glowed not for their greatness, but because they were known, loved, carried through every storm. Their lives, Uriel said, were not measured in power, but in faith, in the quiet obedience that does not seek reward, but simply trusts. And in that light, Enoch felt the holiness of being known by name, the comfort of being remembered by God, not just as a soul, but as a child, not merely counted, but cherished. The book remained open, its pages turned with purpose, never rushed, never forgotten. And those written within it had not disappeared. They had been held, rise and shine like the stars. And then, in the stillness of that holy place, something began to change. The air stirred, not with wind, but with a new kind of light. It moved, like dawn across the faces of the righteous, calling gently, tenderly. The ground did not shake, the skies did not shout. And yet the resurrection began. One by one the righteous stood, not in fear, but in wonder. Their bodies were not as they once were, yet they were wholly themselves, every wound gone, every sorrow healed. What had been fragile was now full. What had faded was now radiant. Enoch watched as they rose, like flowers opening to sunlight. Their eyes shone like the stars. Their limbs moved with strength, not haste. They did not rise in confusion, but in joy, like waking from a deep and peaceful sleep. Uriel spoke, "This is the promise fulfilled, the resurrection not of myth, but of truth. They were clothed not in linen, but in glory. Light wrapped around them like garments, soft and pure. No voice called them from tombs. They had never been lost. They had only waited. And now the time had come. Their laughter filled the garden, not wild but deep, the kind of laughter that speaks of healing completed. They looked at one another and knew each other fully, not just by name, but by soul. Enoch was silent, overcome with peace. This was not a return to life as it had been. This was life as it was always meant to be, uncorrupted, whole, everlasting. The stars above seemed to echo their rising. The heavens opened wider. And the earth, though far below, stirred as if it too remembered the promise. Together with the Son of Man, and then at the edge of the garden, walking as calmly as the morning sun, came the Son of Man. He did not arrive with trumpet or fanfare. He came as a friend, a shepherd, a king whose crown was made of peace. The righteous turned to him, and their joy deepened. For this was the one they had trusted even when they could not see. The one they had followed through sorrow, through darkness, through silence. And now he was here, smiling, gentle, eternal. He walked among them, speaking their names, not in formality, but in affection. He touched their shoulders. He lifted their faces. He sat with them beneath the trees. He listened, though he already knew every word they longed to say. They ate with him, not from silver, but from hands. They drank, not from vessels, but from joy. And in his presence rest returned to their souls again and again. Uriel said, "This is not reward, it is reunion." What had been lost was restored. What had been broken was mended, not for a day, but forever. The Son of Man laughed with them, sang with them, walked beside them along the river's edge. And when they grew tired, he led them to rest, not because they needed sleep, but because rest was part of joy. There were no questions that needed asking. In his gaze they found every answer. In his presence, they needed nothing else. And Enoch, though only watching, felt that he too had drawn nearer to the heart of God. For in this garden, in this light, in this gathering of the risen, he saw the fullness of heaven's promise that we were never meant to walk alone, that death was never meant to be the end, that love, in the end, always gathers us home. Chapter 18. The Last Gate and the Eternal Light. There are places where creation thins, where the edges of what is known meet the hush of what is beyond. It was to this place that Uriel brought Enoch, not with haste, but with holy stillness. They traveled not across distance, but through understanding, led by a light that did not flicker. Before them stretched the outermost boundary of all things. It did not roar or crack. It simply shimmered like the horizon of a dream. The edge of the cosmos, where the breath of creation met the silence from which it came, Enoch looked, and he saw not emptiness, but guardians, great ones, angels of ancient strength, stood like living pillars, holding back what must not pass. They were still but not asleep. Their presence was like mountains, forged of flame and calm. They watched, not with suspicion, but with sacred duty. Beyond them, Enoch sensed a presence not of form, but of formlessness. The void, a place untouched, unmoved, unspoken, not evil, not yet shaped, the place that only God can know. And yet, that void did not press in. For love stood guard. Uriel spoke gently. Even here, creation is held together, not by force, but by love. Not by walls of stone, but by the will of God. The angels did not speak. Their silence was not absence, it was reverence. Their gaze was not fearful, it was steady. For they had been placed at the gate not to control, but to protect. They stood between chaos and cosmos, between what was and what could be, and Enoch knew, standing in that vast and luminous quiet, that creation was not fragile. It was held, not in the strength of matter, but in the promise of love that never ceases. The walls made of light. Uriel led Enoch further, not by steps but by spirit, and the veil between creation and glory opened gently, like morning fog parting before the sun. What had once been the edge now revealed its beauty. Enoch saw walls not of stone or crystal, but of pure light. They shimmered with color and voice, yet no one had painted them. They pulsed with the rhythm of God's breath, as though every word he had spoken still echoed through their glowing frame. These were the walls of the firmament, the great expanse God had stretched out on the first days of time. But now Enoch saw what eyes of dust could never behold, that light was not a thing, it was a hymn. Every shimmer carried meaning, every flicker told a story. The stars within it hummed softly, their light dancing not at random, but in harmony. They did not burn for their own glory. They moved in obedience, in joy. Their paths were songlines, each one composed by the will of heaven. Uriel said, "This is the word made visible. Every layer of heaven bears the mark of his voice." Enoch saw angels moving along the walls, not climbing, not descending, but existing in peace. They tended the light like gardeners, trimming edges with prayers, renewing songs with silence. Their wings brushed against eternity, and yet they never left their post. There was no division here between work and worship. Every act was both. The harmony was not a melody that could be heard with ears. It was deeper, it was felt in the soul, and Enoch, standing in its midst, felt as though his own heart had begun to glow. The walls were not barriers, they were invitations, not to enter, but to understand. And what they revealed was this, that every layer of creation, seen and unseen, is alive with purpose. Not a single speck of light exists without being called. The veil between worlds. Then the vision grew still. Again, not with quietness, but with pause. Uriel brought Enoch to a place that was neither fully here nor fully there, a threshold. The veil, it was not torn, not broken. It was delicate, like lace woven from dawn and dusk. It moved slightly as though breathing, and through it, Enoch could see both earth and eternity. On one side, the world he had known, mountains, rivers, laughter and sorrow, days and nights, birth and burial. On the other side, a realm of endless now, where light did not chase shadow, but swallowed it in peace. And in between stood Enoch. He felt not pulled, but balanced, not torn, but aware. Uriel whispered, "This is the place where souls dwell." Every human heart walks this threshold. Every moment is a step toward one side or the other. Enoch saw that every soul carried light within it, and shadow too, not as enemies, but as possibilities. Within each person lived a spark, a flicker of the divine. But alongside it, the freedom to turn away, to serve the light or to dim it. He saw men walking with burdens and others carrying joy. He saw hearts hardened like stone and others soft as rain. And all were moving. None stood still forever. The veil did not decide, it simply revealed. Enoch felt the weight of choice, not as burden, but as gift. For love cannot be forced, and heaven does not compel. It invites, and he understood. The veil is not to be feared, it is to be honored. For it is here, in this sacred space between now and forever, that the soul decides who it will be. Not in one moment, but in many. Not with one word, but with many small steps, and so the veil remains, not to divide, but to give room. Room to choose. Room to turn. Room to walk with God. And then he was not. And then, as softly as the wind settles in the hush before nightfall, Enoch's journey came to its final breath. He was not taken by force, not lifted by lightning or consumed by fire. There was no storm, no trumpet, no farewell that shook the ground. He simply was not. The garden did not tremble. The angels did not cry out, but heaven opened and God received him. Not as a stranger crossing into mystery, but as a son returning home. Uriel stood still, his hands folded, his face turned upward. God has taken him, he said, not as a thief in the night, but as a father welcoming a faithful child. There was no grave, no monument of stone, only the memory of a man who walked with God, and the truth that such a walk does not end. For Enoch had walked the paths of heaven. He had seen the chambers of snow, the fire of the throne, the garden of the righteous, and the valley of the eye, second death. He had stood at the edge of the cosmos and heard the song of stars. And now he was at rest. But his story remained. A soft voice across the ages, a promise written not on scrolls but in light, that those who walk with God will never walk alone, not in life, not in death, not in the silence between worlds, and never in the light beyond.